I have played a lot of Crash Bandicoot in my time, probably more than any sane human should. As a result, I'd say I have a pretty educated opinion on how good, or not, each game in the series is. I've done rankings of the entire series twice in the past in the form of tier lists, but those were years ago and my opinions of a lot of these games have changed, especially since I've reacquainted myself with a lot of the post-Naughty Dog pre-remake era games in that time. So what better time than right before the release of Crash Team Rumble to revisit this and rank the Crash games from my favorite to least favorite. A couple of things of note before we get started. First off, I'm not including any of the mobile phone games on this list. I believe that the design philosophy when it comes to mobile games is very different from that of console or handheld titles, so it's not really fair to compare them when it would just result in the list being a lot more bottom heavy. I also don't really have a lot of experience with them anyway, and they're not readily available to play anymore without jumping through several hoops. Hell, I don't even think On the Run is playable at all. I'm also going to rank the N. Sane Trilogy as 3 separate games. I think each title in it has its own strengths and weaknesses, and it makes a lot more sense to judge them each individually as opposed to trying to judge the whole package as one thing. Also, I feel like this is a given, but just in case any wise guy tries to mention it, no, I am not ranking the Thumpin' Wumpa Islands level from Skylanders Imaginators. That is not a Crash game, it is a Crash cameo in a completely different franchise. I realize what can of worms I'm opening with a video like this, so I cannot stress enough, this is my opinion. I would never in my right mind say that anything I state in this video is absolute fact, and no one should treat it as such. This is simply how I perceive the games and how I enjoy them. You're perfectly welcome to disagree, and I encourage that, as long as it doesn't lead to any hostility. So let's all be civil and just have a good time as I rank every Crash Bandicoot game in the series, except mobile games.
You're the worst.
Where do I even begin with Crash Boom Bang? Instead of starting with what's wrong with this game, I think the easier thing would be to say what's right with it. Nothing. That's all this game is. It's just a whole lot of nothing. It's such a horrendous collection of extremely boring minigames that aren't even remotely fun, and they all make horrible use of the DS's touchscreen. The minigames don't even have anything to do with Crash at all. It really just feels like they took an extremely generic Mario Party ripoff and just threw in the Crash characters after the fact. The art style is also absolutely atrocious, going for cel-shaded graphics using the characters' Japanese renders, and it just looks terrible. It's a complete eyesore to look at, and it just doesn't mesh with the Crash series at all. I realize that story is not really ever a focal point of Crash games, but the plot in this game is just outright ridiculous, with some dude called the Viscount inviting everyone to the World Cannonball Race. What the f kind of name is that? With the purpose of having the winner find the super big power crystal so he can get a free wish. Yeah, it's just a lot of nonsense. I think the biggest kicker here though is that you don't even need to win for the game to progress. It doesn't matter if you're the one victorious on whatever board you're playing. As long as someone accomplishes the goal, the game will move you to the next part of the story. So not only is every single thing in this game boring and dull to the point of misery, none of it matters anyway. You literally cannot lose this game. What is the point of any of this? A lot of Crash games that are bad tend to be unfair or unplayable or just infuriating in some other way. But Crash Boom Bang is just nothing. There's no redeeming qualities about this game, and no, bringing Tawna and Pinstripe back is not a redeeming quality. They would have been better off continuing to be forgotten than being in this dumpster fire of a game, and I'm using the term game very loosely here. One other Mario Party clone that I see get a lot of negativity online is Sonic Shuffle. I've never played that game or seen any footage of it, but I can still say with 100% confidence that Crash Boom Bang is much worse. This transcends being the worst Crash game. It's just one of the worst games I've ever played, period. Hell, it might even be the worst. I haven't played a lot of the commonly accepted worst games of all time, but I have played 3D Tetris for the Virtual Boy, and yeah, I still prefer it over Boom Bang. These guys made Sonic Rush! That game is awesome! What the hell happened here? So yeah, Crash Boom Bang bottoms out this list by a considerable margin. If you haven't played it, don't. Seriously. That's 30 minutes of my life that I'm never getting back. Horrible! Even if Boom Bang is quite handily the absolute worst Crash game in my opinion, I'd say the DS version of Minor Mutant is a pretty easy second from the bottom. The plot is once again a crock of nonsense, but I'd probably be more willing to ignore that if it wasn't literally just the plot of the console version cut and pasted with absolutely zero context. You get a cutscene at the start, nothing for the rest of the game, and then a cutscene at the end. The level design is extremely boring, with very little in the way of actual platforming. The combat is extremely one-dimensional and repetitive, and the Titans you jack have almost nothing in the way of variation, with there being a grand total of 5 in the entire game, and they're all worse than Crash is on his own. There's no reason to use any of them unless you're specifically forced to. One place that you will want to use them for, however, is in the boss fights, because these are some of the most horrendously unfair, poorly designed bosses I have ever seen. The attacks they barrage you with are absolutely relentless, and you can't deal more than chip damage to them unless you have a Titan. And if you lose your Titan mid-fight, good luck. The final boss, though, is something else. I thought Titans Uka Uka and the entirety of Crash Bash were the epitome of rage-inducing Crash content, but man, oh man, this fight beats out both of them. On top of everything I've already said about this game's bosses, the final boss ups it all to 11 and also has the ability to completely regenerate its health. Mind Over Mutant is a lot like Boom Bang in that most of it just feels like a lot of nothing. Where it gets a few points over Boom Bang is that there actually is some meaning in what you're doing, but what the game has to offer ranges from incredibly boring and monotonous to just outright infuriating and unfair. There was absolutely zero effort put into this game, and it shows. You're really better off playing anything else, except Boom Bang.
Wow, this is garbage.
A lot of what I said about Mind Over Mutant DS also applies to Crash of the Titans on GBA, so I'll keep this short and sweet. Actually, basically everything I said about Mind Over Mutant DS applies, with the one notable difference being that Crash's performance versus the Titans is the inverse here. Crash himself is terrible, while all the Titans are absurdly powerful. But all in all, you have the same issue of boring and uninspired level design and combat, horrendously unfair boss fights that dish out way more damage than you can comparatively deal to them, and just a whole lot of nothing. The part where I'll give this game some props over Mind Over Mutant DS is that there's a lot of unintentionally funny aspects that stem from how bad the game is, including this text of Aku Aku, the armless mask, somehow picking up a piece of paper, and several of the mugshot sprites used for each character, like, look at this sprite of Tiny! Who approved this? I also feel like the presentation of the game gives off the impression that there was at least a modicum of effort put into this, whereas Mind Over Mutant DS clearly had no effort put into it at all. Even with that effort though, there's very little of value in this game, and that's all that really needs to be said.
Hey, is that one purple?
Vicarious Visions has actually made more Crash games than any other developer, and with that in mind, I'd say their track record in terms of quality is very solid. Their one major fumble, though, is Crash Bandicoot Purple. There was so much potential in a crossover with Spyro the Dragon, so much you could do when combining both series, and yet all we got is a collection of minigames with some trading cards on the side. This in and of itself wouldn't immediately be bad, but very few of the minigames are actually fun. A lot of them in fact are very boring, unfairly designed, or just terrible to control. I'd say that the only ones that spark some real joy out of me are the ones that actually borrow elements from the Crash platformers, such as the Crate Smash and Freefall minigames. I guess the waitlists are also kind of fun too in their own hilarious way. I really just don't know what happened here. If I were to guess, I'd say that they had such a short time to develop anything since both this and its sister game, Spyro Orange, came out so close between both Nitrocart and Twinsanity that Universal probably wanted to get a very quick and cheap cash grab out of them, and this was the end result. Somehow, against all odds though, we got the better deal, because Spyro Orange managed to be even worse than this game. How is that possible? Not a clue.
You fail.
Crash Bash is awful. I know that this is gonna upset a lot of people, and I get it. I was extremely fond of this game as a kid and had plenty of great memories of it. And then I played it as an adult. The core issue ultimately lies in the game's difficulty. I don't really think there's any other way to describe it other than that the AI blatantly cheats. It's pretty innocuous at first, but as you progress through the game, they become more relentless and more perfect in how they play that you really just have to hope you get lucky. Combined with how repetitive things get, what with every group of 4 minigames essentially being reskins of the same concept, and how often you're going to be doing the same minigames over and over and over between trophies, gems, crystals, and relics, and that's before factoring in how often you'll just be failing these challenges, it almost feels like the game was just designed to be as infuriating as possible. The most common rebuttal I hear when I bring up these points on stream, and believe me, the topic comes up a lot, is that the game's single-player campaign sucks, but the 4-player free-for-all mode is great with friends, and honestly, I don't agree with that either. While it's certainly not BS like playing against the AI is, at the end of the day you're still playing the same monotonous minigames, most of which aren't really all that fun in the first place. The Crate Crush minigames are probably the most fun, but everything else is either too stiff or takes too long to have lasting appeal. Even when you have a full group of 4 people, you can maybe squeeze about 30 minutes of fun out of it until you'll probably want to play something else. I know that a lot of people have huge amounts of nostalgia for this game, I get it, but I truly don't believe there's really all that much about Bash that's good. Except for the soundtrack, that's fire. But the game as a whole is an infuriating, unfair mess, and even when it's not, it's just boring and extremely repetitive. Now can we please stop asking for a remake of it? Like, seriously. Something I would always hear from several people is how awesome the GBA version of Crash Nitrocart is, and how it's just as good if not better than the console version. And after playing it for myself, I just don't see it. I think the mechanics from the console racing games are translated well enough, but the game is an absolute eyesore to look at. The draw distance is terrible, the backgrounds blend in way too much with the tracks themselves, which makes it really hard to tell what you're doing, and the way the backgrounds move is also really disorienting. I wouldn't be surprised if this game made some people motion sick. The amount of lag the game suffers from is also pretty horrendous. I also found the AI balancing to be absolutely terrible. Either all of the CPUs were really bad and beating them was a cakewalk, or they were so relentlessly on your tailgate that you would only ever win by fractions of a second, and God forbid you make any kind of mistake when they're playing like this. I've seen more than a few people say that this game is better than its GBA brethren Mario Kart Super Circuit, but not only is that not really a high bar, after seeing some gameplay of Super Circuit, I don't think I actually believe that. I don't know, I was really disappointed with this game. I always heard nothing but positive things about it, but what I experienced was overall just an unfun handheld kart racer.
Titans, go!
Crash of the Titans. The cop-out here would be for me to talk about how this game is bad because it's not a true Crash Bandicoot game, and how the direction it took the series was so alien to everything that preceded it that it could just never live up to what came before. But honestly, that's not even really why I dislike this game. While I definitely don't think Crash should have gone in the direction of being a beat-em-up game, and I vastly prefer the series to stick to its platforming roots, I'd be willing to look past this fact about Crash of the Titans if it was actually executed well. And it's not. Platforming takes a major backseat in this game so that combat can be the primary focus, but said combat is extremely boring and repetitive, and you'll probably be sick of it after the first few levels, especially with how long each level, or episode, as the game refers to them, is. The game also gets more unfair the further you get into it, with later levels frequently consisting of mob fights against titans who are so much more powerful than you that all it takes is 1 or 2 hits for them to wipe out your entire health bar. And they always gang up on you, so avoiding them is an insanely tall order. And the game never really lets up once it begins doing this. The boss fight with Uka Uka is an actual war crime, like, I'm pretty sure it violates all 4 of the Geneva Conventions. The Titan jacking mechanic is interesting, but the fact that your movement options are so limited when using them means you'll only want to use them when necessary, which unfortunately is quite often because either you'll have puzzles that require a Titan to get past, or you'll have to fight even more Titans that you'd be horribly outmatched against if Crash was by himself. Another major issue I have with the game is the script. That's probably a weird criticism to hear, but this game actually does attempt to have a serious story going on, and I think it could have worked if the dialogue wasn't so bad. I realize that the word I'm about to use is very overused, but there really isn't a better way to describe it. It's cringe. I really feel like the developers for this game saw Twinsanity lean really hard into the humor department, saw that it worked, but didn't understand why it worked, and the end result was this mess of a script with some of the most annoying or out-of-place jokes ever. Like right before the final boss when Nina says,
"Crash, get out of my robot! This is my body and my right to choose!"
I can't believe they got away with that. The Crash series is no stranger to adult humor like that, but it's always done much more subtly, much more maturely. This is just so blatant, so out there, and it doesn't even really fit with the context of the situation either. And the game is just filled with these moments.
You did it, Crash! Thanks, big brother!
Oh, gross. Get a room.
They are siblings!
That's it! That's fantastic, Crash!
How long have you had that in your pants? Nina, betraying me is the most vile, evil thing you could have ever done. You were a skank.
He calls his niece a skank. Aesthetically, I actually think the game is fine. The environments are very well done, and while the redesigns of the major characters is one of the most controversial aspects of this game, I don't unanimously hate them. I've actually grown kind of fond of how Crash looks in this game, though it's definitely not my favorite look of his. Engine's barely changed, Coco, Crunch, and Cortex are all fine enough, and I actually think Nina's appearance is an upgrade from her old look from Twinsanity and Tag Team Racing. Aku Aku and Uka Uka aren't that great though, and we don't talk about Tiny. I think Crash of the Titans is the black sheep in the series for a lot of reasons. It's far from the worst game we've ever gotten from this franchise, but it just does so many things wrong that I can't bring myself to enjoy it.
Adventure time!
Unsurprisingly, I think that all of the platformers in the Crash series are at least serviceable, except for the Huge Adventure. Taking the PS1 formula and translating it to a 2D handheld platform should work in theory, but man did they fumble this one hard. It almost feels like they didn't account for this game being on such a small screen with the level design, because there are copious amounts of leaps of faith and extremely obnoxious hazard placing that you couldn't possibly know how to deal with without simply guessing, the former being most prominent in the bonus rounds, and the latter becoming more egregious the further into the game you get. I realize that trial and error is deeply rooted into the Crash series as a whole, and I don't actually have a problem with that when it's done well. But trial and error shouldn't mean blindly praying and hoping you get lucky, and that's unfortunately a very frequent case with the Huge Adventure. And on the rare occasion that the game isn't just completely BSing you with its level design, it's just really boring. The biggest offender that comes to mind are the 3 jetpack and blimp levels, which go on for several minutes and are completely on the rail auto-scrollers. I don't even mind that everything in this game is basically copy-pasted from the PS1 games, because that was clearly the intent from the start. Something being very derivative of a prior work isn't inherently a bad thing as long as it's done well. Unfortunately, it's painfully obvious that the Huge Adventure was Vicarious Vision's first outing with the series because there's a lot of poor design choices that severely hold it back. Thankfully, every game they made after this point, except for Crash Purple, is a huge step up in quality, but we'll get to that later.
Look at all those chickens.
If there's any game in the series in which my opinion on it has dramatically improved in recent times, it's definitely Crash Tag Team Racing. It's still not anywhere close to the upper echelon of the series in my opinion, but I used to perpetually have this game as a bottom 5 contender even just a few years ago. When I went back and gave this game another shot though, I realized that there's actually quite a lot about it that's pretty fun. The biggest standout is undoubtedly the park exploration that, despite the game's name, forms the bulk of the gameplay. A wide open sandbox style Crash game where you travel around fulfilling quests and other objectives is a really cool concept that I wish they had just put all of their focus on, because it's absolutely fantastic and there's so much potential here. There's also a lot of rewards for simply poking around the environment and seeing what you can find, with the most notable examples of this being the gags and the dioramas. The game has a huge amount of minigames to play, which fits perfectly with the shoddy theme park aesthetic they were going for. And while I won't say that all of these minigames are great, there are some really enjoyable ones such as bowling. Unfortunately, in spite of all that, there's also quite a lot of things about this game that really hold it back, most notably the game's namesake Tag Team Racing. Being able to fuse with other racers mid-race is cool in theory, until you realize that it makes winning every race completely effortless. The AI moves with such perfect precision that you can let them take the wheel for the entire race, and then simply unfuse mere feet away from the finish line for a free win. A common counterpoint I hear when I voice this criticism is, oh, well, you could just, not do that, man. First of all, that's a freaking cop-out. If the game's namesake feature is so poorly executed that the best way to enjoy the game is to simply not do it, that already speaks volumes about how much of a problem it is. That aside, even if you choose to simply not clash with other racers, you're left with very boring racing, featuring bare-bones mechanics and extremely basic and uninspired tracks. This is also the game where character derailment started to really get out of control. So many of the mainstay characters have vastly different personalities from their prior appearances, and for some of them it took a long time for them to revert to their old selves. Cortex is largely the same as his Twinsanity self, so that's fine, but I'm not really sure why they decided to make the lovable and heroic Crash Bandicoot a sadistic bully who gets his kicks out of torturing everyone else around him. I'm really glad that this is the only game where he's like this. This is also the game that turned Coco into a snobby brat, which only really started to get toned down with Mind Over Mutant, and it took until the N. Sane Trilogy for her to fully return to her sassy but ultimately kind personality. It made Crunch a Mr. T XP, and I don't know why. I will say though, the engine is genuinely very funny, and Nina's shift to being even more evil and deranged than Cortex is a large step up from her Twinsanity personality of no personality. Overall, Crash Tag Team Racing is such a weird case. There's so many things about it that are genuinely great, and so much of it that's genuinely not. A lot of it is bad in a funny kind of way though, and it definitely veers the game into so bad it's good territory. At the end of the day though, the bad does hold this game back a lot. I had always heard great things about the DS version of Crash of the Titans, and after finally getting to play it for myself, yeah, it lives up to it. I really wish the console version of the game took more pages out of this version's book, because it knew perfectly how to bring in the new mechanics of Crash of the Titans and blend them with the classic formula from the platformers. The end result is a game that tries its best to move the series forward, while also not forgetting its roots. That's something I'm sad the console version couldn't get right. All of the framework is there. Linear platforming, crates to smash, things to collect, bonus rounds, the works. It mixes perfectly with the combat and leveling mechanics of the console version of Crash of the Titans. I do still have some issues with the game. The sound design is extremely questionable, like, who thought a laugh track was a good idea? Some of the enemies also have really grating sound effects that play over and over. I also didn't find any of the bosses to be particularly great, and the final fight in particular was just very drawn out. I wish there was more I could say, but this is admittedly one of the Crash games that I have the least experience with. Overall though, it manages to strike a really good harmony between the classic era Crash games and the Titans era games. It really makes you wonder why they didn't just hire Amaze Entertainment again to make the DS version of Mind Over Mutant, because that is a downgrade of biblical proportions.
Mom!
Crash Mind Over Mutant is a gigantic improvement over Crash of the Titans, and I will die on that hill. Pretty much all of my biggest criticisms of Titans are rectified here. Instead of having a heavy focus on combat with the platforming taking a back seat, Mind Over Mutant splits the difference 50-50, with both combat and platforming in the spotlight. The Titans themselves have improved tremendously, being able to jump and be stored away until you want to use them, meaning you can stick to Crash himself if you want to without being forced to give up a Titan you have that might be useful later. The difficulty and unfairness of Titans has been toned down dramatically too. You no longer feel horribly outmatched all the time, and mob fights are very reasonable. The game does away entirely with levels, so there are no gratuitous episodes that go on for way too long. Instead, we have one cohesive map that gradually opens up Metroidvania style as you progress. That really is the best way to describe Mind Over Mutant. It's a Metroidvania, just on a 3D plane instead of a 2D one. And before someone mentions it, no, I don't hate the backtracking in this game. Is it excessive? Yeah, sure, but the areas you have to traverse are so short that I was never really gnashing my teeth or pulling my hair out at the thought of going back through something I'd already traveled through. I feel like a lot of Crash fans have some vitriolic hatred for backtracking as a concept, which I'll talk more about later in this video, but really, the backtracking in this game is not that bad, and it's certainly not the deal breaker that I see so many people prop it up as when discussing why they don't like this game. One of my biggest praises towards Mind Over Mutant is how much of a dramatic improvement both the script and the characters' personalities got. Basically every bad thing that started with tag team racing and got worse with Titans is reined in here. Coco still has a bratty side to her, but she's for the most part returned to being sassy instead of an absolute snob. Crunch is still a bit of a Mr. T XP, but it's largely pretty funny here. Engine is hilarious as ever, Crash is fully back to being his goofy self, and Tiny's just gone. The real show stealer though is Embryo. His characterization here is completely different from the PS1 games, but he's an absolute riot the whole time. That's really the most important thing about this game's script. It's funny. Not as funny as Twinsanity or Crash 4, but it got a lot of genuine laughs out of me, and it's a huge step up from the absolute cringe fest that Titan's script was. The single biggest thing that holds this game back is just how short it is. It really shows that this game was finished only a year after Titans, because everything moves at such a breakneck pace, and so many great ideas or characters are just left completely undeveloped as a result. You can beat the entire game in less than 5 hours in a single sitting, and that's honestly really tragic because what's here is great in my opinion. It's just not fleshed out, and there's not a lot of it. All in all though, Mind Over Mutant left me very pleasantly surprised when I replayed it. It's nowhere near the greatest thing Crash has ever had to offer, but I think it deserves more love than it gets, and it definitely deserves more love than Crash of the Titans. Side note real quick, I forgot to mention the different art styles of the cutscenes in the script. They're fine. I don't feel strongly about them one way or the other. If any game in the series comes to mind when I hear the word derivative, it's The Wrath of Cortex. The game is extremely infamous at this point for essentially being Crash Bandicoot 3.5, doing phenomenally little to innovate on what its predecessors established. Again, I don't think being derivative of a prior work is inherently bad, and I do think Wrath of Cortex does a pretty good job overall. The physics are a bit floaty, but I don't really think that's to the game's detriment, and the level design overall has some pretty high highs, albeit not without some low lows. Funnily enough, despite how much this game gets criticized for not changing up the formula that much, I think when it does try to shake things up is when it's at its weakest. That is, the sheer abundance of vehicles. I also don't think that vehicle levels, or gimmicks for lack of a better term, are inherently bad either, but Wrath of Cortex's execution of them leaves much to be desired. The ones that are copy-pasted directly from the PS1 games are fine enough, and the Atmosphere is a standout in how phenomenal of an addition it is, but the rest of them range from being mediocre to miserable. The reason this is so much more of a problem than it is in Crash 3 is because not only are the vehicles in that game executed much better, but also because they are so much more of a dominating presence in the Wrath of Cortex. Yes, half of Crash 3's levels are vehicle-based, but even Wrath of Cortex's platforming levels more often than not will dip their toes into some vehicle portions, sometimes for half the level. There are 30 levels in this game, and in only 6 of them do you control Crash for their entirety. It's fairly well known by now that Wrath of Cortex was originally supposed to be a much more ambitious, open-world game before Mark Cerny left Universal and the project got handed to Traveler's Tales, who were only given a year to make the game and as a result chose to play things very safe. And I think they did a respectable job given the circumstances. Unfortunately, said circumstances work against Wrath of Cortex. It's still one of the better Crash games in my opinion, but it just pales in the shadow of its predecessors. Oh, the loads also suck on PS2, but I've been playing on Xbox for a few years now where they're completely fine, so I kinda just forgot about that until just now when I went back and added this line to the script.
Hey, I'm driving!
I've brought up derivativeness not being inherently bad twice already, but it doesn't ring truer for any game in the series than Crash Nitro Kart. The biggest criticism I can give this game is that it's not as good as Crash Team Racing, and, spoiler alert, that's a really high bar. The physics are a bit on the clunkier side and don't feel as crisp as CTR, and the sound design and voice direction can get pretty grating, but outside of that, I really don't have any problems with this game. The mechanics of CTR are more or less ported over very well, and while there are only 13 tracks in comparison to its predecessor's 18, I think they're just as good, if not better, than the ones in CTR. The zero gravity mechanic is incorporated super well, and just let it be known that Crash Bandicoot did it way before Mario Kart did. I don't really know what else to say. Crash Nitro Kart is solid. It may not be as good as its PS1 counterpart, but if that's the worst thing I can say about it, well, that's a good place to be.
But now's not the time to get cocky.
Just outside of the top 10, we have the first game in the N. Sane Trilogy. Well, actually it's the second game, but it's the first one on this list. As a whole, I really enjoy the N. Sane Trilogy, and credit it for pretty much single-handedly reviving the Crash series, but being from the ground-up remakes means that naturally some things were going to be different in the transition from PS1 to the modern era, and unfortunately I think Crash 2 takes the brunt of NST's biggest shortcomings. One thing that most people immediately notice is how much less lenient platforming is in the remakes compared to the original. Crash's jump height is shorter, he falls faster, and when he bounces off of any object, whether it be a crate, enemy, or any other type of bouncy surface, for whatever reason, Crash's airspeed gets cut in half. This makes any type of platforming way more precise than it needs to be, and while the poster child example of this being an issue has always been the high road in Crash 1, I'd argue that as a whole it negatively affects Crash 2 the most out of any game in the trilogy. Basic jumping in this game feels nearly useless, and any section that requires multiple bounces in a row becomes much more nightmarish to deal with. The best example of this is the death route in Piston in a Way, where the section where you have to bounce off of multiple tentacle bots in a row is so much more strict, to the point that you basically have to be nearly perfect. Crash 2 also suffers the most in the presentation department. I feel like the N. Sane Trilogy's art direction has already started to not age well, but Crash 2 in particular just looks so bland and lifeless compared to just how bright and colorful its PS1 counterpart looks. The music is also a huge downgrade, with almost every remix failing to come even close to the quality of the originals. That isn't to say that the remake doesn't make any improvements whatsoever though. The addition of time trials and speed shoes is very welcome and it fits very naturally into the game. Other quality of life changes, such as repurposing the load save screen to be boss portals that makes refighting them far less cryptic, and making the 6th warp room readily accessible at any point after you unlock it, are great too. And at the end of the day, it's still Crash 2. The framework of an amazing game is still there, even if there are several things that hold it back. I don't think I'd ever recommend this version of the game over the original PS1 version to a newcomer, but if it's the only version available to you, it's more than serviceable.
This is getting out of hand. Now there are 2 of them.
Everyone talks about how much of an improvement Crash 2 makes over Crash 1, but not enough people talk about how much of a glow-up Entranced is compared to the huge adventure. Every criticism I have with the latter game is fixed here. The level design is much more suited for a GBA title, with almost all of the leaps of faith and obnoxious enemy placement being completely eliminated. Something else I really like about this game is just how much it tries to innovate on the standard formula while also not straying too far away from it. In place of the warp rooms, you have a Crash 1 style map, except the paths branch. So while you don't have access to all of the levels in a hub immediately, you still have multiple options you can take to gradually make your way to the boss. I think it's a really nice happy medium between the warp room style of Crash 2, 3, and Wrath of Cortex, and the linear-based map style of Crash 1 and Crash 4. The power-ups have been shaken up too, with the standard Super Body Slam and Double Jump now being part of Crash's basic kit, and 2 new power-ups being added in the incredibly powerful Super Slide and the incredibly not useful Rocket Jump. Going even further with the shakeup is that this is the only game in the series where Cortex isn't present at all, with Entropy taking center stage as this game's main villain. Overall, Entrance does a fantastic job of shaking up the series' classic formula while also not straying too far from it. It does just enough to make things not feel stale, but doesn't do so much that it feels like a total departure. It's probably the single most overlooked game in the entire franchise in my opinion, and deserves so much more attention than it gets.
1, 2, 3.
I feel like Crash 3 overall is harmed far less by the changes that the N. Sane Trilogy makes compared to Crash 2. The altering of jumping and bouncing physics hardly matters when a lot of the precision platforming that is negatively harmed by it just doesn't exist in Crash 3. The presentation suffers a lot less as well, since a lot of the level environments in Crash 3 lend themselves to looking visually stunning even in the remake's art style. The vehicles all handle very differently, to be sure, but I will go to bat for them as a whole and say that most of them really aren't that bad. Yes, including the jet ski, you all just need to stop complaining and learn how to deal with wider turning before saying it's unplayable. Hell, the plane is just a straight upgrade compared to its original counterpart, outside of Rings of Power. As far as additions to the game made by the remake, Crash 3 doesn't really get much in that regard compared to the other 2 games. It does, however, get Future Tense, which is quite honestly a fantastic level. As long as you don't get the PC exclusive crash that happens if you leave too many Wumpa Fruit enemies lying around. However, even if Crash 3 isn't directly harmed by the N. Sane Trilogy in the same way that Crash 2 is, I still think it doesn't really do much of anything to set itself apart from its PS1 counterpart. Yes, Future Tense is fantastic, the plane handles much better, and the basic underwater movement feels much less stiff, but the remaining vehicles, while I will defend from detractors who say they're outright terrible, do still feel like downgrades overall. The motorcycle, Purah, and the plane in Rings of Power all have this weird stiffness to them when traveling at top speed, and the fish mech in the underwater levels... This thing is awful. I really don't know why so many people go for the jet ski's throat when this thing is right there. The presentation also, while still not as big of a downgrade compared to Crash 2, just doesn't hold a candle to the original, both visually and in terms of music and general sound design. So although Crash 3 doesn't suffer much in the transition from PS1 to N. Sane Trilogy, it still does suffer a bit, and doesn't get enough to make up for it. Even then, however, it's still a very solid entry, and very deserving of its spot in the top 10.
Alright, let's do this one last time.
The N. Sane Trilogy version of Crash 1 is probably the one where you can make the biggest case for it outshining the original, and although it's only one spot above the remake of Crash 3, I'd say the gap in quality between the two is very noticeable. The remake of Crash 1 is just filled with so many quality of life changes compared to its original counterpart that simply cannot be ignored. The elephant in the room, of course, is the change to how gems work, being more in line with Crash 2 and 3 and not requiring you to beat the entire level without dying to be collected. The next biggest thing would be the improving of the save system to be in line with its sequels as well, as the original Crash 1 save system is horribly archaic. The presentation also works much better in this game, with many of Crash 1's set pieces translating quite well to the N. Sane Trilogy's art style, and while the soundtrack is still overall a slight downgrade in my opinion, there are quite a lot of standout songs that sound just as good if not better than their originals. I'm pretty mixed on how I feel about the bonuses being mandatory for box completion in this version of the game. While that is good for bringing the game in line with its sequels, I feel like it's painfully easy to tell that a lot of these bonuses were just not designed with full completion in mind. The way that the remake's physics affect this game is also a mixed bag. While it's not nearly as detrimental as it is to Crash 2, I do think that there are more notable situations of jumping and bouncing having an adverse effect compared to Crash 3. And when it's noticeable, it's very noticeable. The time trials don't translate to this game quite as well as they do Crash 2, but I'd still say they're overall a pretty welcome addition. Stormy Ascent finally seeing the light of day without hacking is a massive blessing. I'll get into more detail on why I still ultimately prefer the original Crash 1, in spite of all the improvements the remake adds, when I get to that game on the list. As a whole though, the N. Sane Trilogy version of the game is extremely solid, and I'd say it's the better choice for total newcomers to the series due to how much it improves on the archaic mechanics of the original.
Well, it's about time.
If there's any word I would use to describe Crash 4, it's extreme. This game really dials everything about the Crash formula up to 11, and while that means the game has some phenomenal highs, it also means it has some pretty abhorrent lows. I actually plan on making a full video on how I feel about Crash 4 in celebration of the game's 3-year anniversary later this year, so I won't go into full detail right now. But to summarize, I think Crash 4's biggest strengths are its incredible level design, its tight and fluid controls, its successful attempt at putting a bigger emphasis on the story and comedy, its art style, and its fantastic utilization of gimmicks in the form of the quantum masks. Where it really falters though is just how bloated everything is. There's just way too much you have to do in order to get the full experience out of this game, and while I don't think the high difficulty or the hidden crates and gems are a bad thing in a vacuum, the sheer volume of just how much there is makes it incredibly draining to play this game to its fullest. Inverted mode in particular is just... why? Why does this make up half of 106%? In recent times, I've come to really value when a game has high highs and low lows over when a game is just consistently decent across the board. In other words, I think that if a game's peak moments are strong enough, they can make up for any weaker moments I find, and this will be a running trend with the remaining games on the list. By this logic, Crash 4 would be very near the top because I think at its peak it delivers the absolute best that the Crash series has to offer. But the game's low points are unfortunately so weak that they manage to bring those strong points down with them. I'm not a stickler who thinks 100% completion is the be-all end-all of a Crash game, otherwise I'd have this game way lower than number 7. But I'd be hard-pressed to say that the game can be higher than any of the other games that are strong on their own and then become even better when you go for full completion. Crash 4 gets weaker when you do this. Don't get it twisted though, I love Crash 4 a lot, more so than any of the games in the N. Sane Trilogy, with the one possible exception being Crash 1. If its best moments made up its entirety, it would be in genuine contention for the best Crash game ever. Its very severe flaws sadly hold it back though. Whoa! Speaking of high highs and low lows, this is why I'm still very fond of the original Crash Bandicoot, even in spite of its archaic aspects and the fact that the N. Sane Trilogy version improves a lot of the quality of life. The level design in this game is, in my opinion, the best of the trilogy, and among the best in the entire series. The inspiration from 2D platformers of the past can be felt the most here. While later games would gradually lean more and more towards long tunnels with a handful of pits and obstacles, Crash 1 still puts a huge amount of emphasis on actual precise jumping from platform to platform, to a degree that we wouldn't really see again until Crash 4. From an aesthetic perspective, while the graphics and art style of this game haven't aged quite as well as Crash 2 or 3, I still think they hold a pretty unique charm to them that is lost a bit in the translation to the N. Sane Trilogy. Not nearly as badly as Crash 2 or even Crash 3 suffers, but still a bit. I also think one of the biggest strengths of Crash 1 that really doesn't get talked about is the story it subtly tells as you progress through the game. You can see Crash's journey across the island, starting from his washing up on Insanity Beach, infiltrating and escaping the native village, traversing through abandoned cities and underground ruins, all the way until you reach Cortex's island, where you see him break into the factory, scale the outer walls of the castle, and finally enter the castle itself. Likewise, you also see how the environment changes as Cortex's influence gradually becomes stronger. You start off on the first island where he has had almost no impact whatsoever. By the time you reach the second island, there's some influence to be seen, and it's largely been abandoned by the natives who once inhabited it. And when you reach the third and final island, he has total control. There's pollution and industrialization rampant throughout. This is Cortex's island. It's subtle, but it's so poignant and so effective, and this type of storytelling gets lost with the transition to Warp Room starting with Crash 2, and like I said earlier, we wouldn't really see anything of this sort again until Crash 4. With all that said, Crash 1 still has quite a bit that holds it back. As previously established, the checkpoint and saving mechanics are horribly archaic, the former in particular making 100% in this game a lot more frustrating to go for. The levels are also a lot simpler, with far fewer secrets to look for, and the ones that do exist are a bit too cryptic for their own good. And while I do think the controls are a bit overblown in how clunky they are, I do think there's a stiffness to them that takes getting used to, especially when you consider that the game is D-pad only. None of this really does a significant amount to dampen the enjoyment I have with the game though, even when going for 100%, and that's why I still have it above both its remake and Crash 4.
Come on, Gary, it's a race! A race!
Crash Team Racing set the bar high not just for Crash spin-offs, but also for kart racers as a whole. I don't think it's an exaggeration at all to say that this game is in the running for greatest kart racer of all time. Between the crisp controls, wonderful tracks, and surprisingly deep and intricate mechanics, this is a game that can be enjoyed by just about anyone, even if they're not a fan of the Crash series as a whole. The time trials, and especially the adventure mode, guarantee that this game is also an incredible single-player experience, and despite the fact that adventure mode is stuffed to burst with so much content that would seem overly repetitive, the core gameplay is so good, and the extra challenges are distinct enough that it barely, if ever, feels like a chore compared to how something like Crash 4 handled it. I really don't know what else to say. Naughty Dog really pulled out all of the stops with Crash Team Racing, and I think their farewell to the series more than delivered. It really speaks volumes that even to this day, people generally have nothing but high praise for this game.
It's a twister, it's a twister.
I've never hated Crash 3, but if you were to ask me a few years ago what I thought of it, I wouldn't speak nearly as positively of it as I do now. Sure, I'd never go as far as to tell you it's bad, but I would have cited half the game being vehicle levels, the lesser focus on precise platforming, and the weirder momentum compared to Crash 2, all as reasons why I felt like this was easily the weakest of the original trilogy. All that has changed though, because in the past 2 years I've put a lot more time into Crash 3, and as a result I've gained a newfound appreciation for it. The vehicles do take up half the game, but like I said before, I don't think gimmicks are inherently bad, and Crash 3 does them pretty well overall. Are they my preferred way to play Crash? No, not at all. I'd still take platforming over vehicles any day of the week, but I'm not hating the time I spend playing any of these levels, and even find them to be quite enjoyable. A lot of the least interesting levels in this game are straight up tunnels with really few threatening obstacles to deal with, but when the level design is at its best, it outshines Crash 2 and gets really damn close to matching Crash 1. And while the heavy momentum that Crash has in the air compared to Crash 2 can make some of the more precise aspects rough, I find that that's not really the biggest deal when instances where that level of precision is demanded of you are so few and far between. The boss fights are also a massive step up from both of the game's predecessors, as previously established in my last video where I ranked all of the series boss fights. You should go check that out by the way if you haven't, I'll leave a link in the description. All of the animations are great, and the environments are vibrant, varied, and colorful. The art style here really is timeless. Get it? Because it's a time travel game, haha! Go back in time before 2021, before I gave this game another chance, and I would have told you that it was the weakest game in the trilogy. Now, it makes a very strong case for it being my favorite game in the trilogy. But more on that later. Surpassing Crash Team Racing was such an unbelievably high bar that I didn't think any developer would ever be able to accomplish. But man did Beenox pull it off with Crash Team Racing Nitro Fueled. Everything that makes Crash Team Racing so great was translated extremely well into this remake, and some of it was done even better. And that's not even getting into just how filled to the brim with content this game is. On top of bringing over every character and track, not just from the original Crash Team Racing, but also Crash Nitro Kart, the game had an entire year's worth of what was essentially free DLC that added even more characters, even more tracks, a near infinite number of customization options for your carts, the ability to change your engine class so certain characters weren't just completely outclassed, and more. There is a nearly endless amount of content in this game, drawing from all corners of the franchise. It's such a massive love letter not just to CTR or the Naughty Dog Crash games, but to Crash Bandicoot as a whole. One of the biggest things that this game absolutely nails though is presentation! I had to do it once. This game is gorgeous. My jaw literally dropped when I saw so many of these tracks for the first time, and I'd say it's visually the most stunning game in the series, building upon and addressing the faults in the N. Sane Trilogy style and managing to create something so beautiful that even Crash 4 can't match it. The Nitro Kart tracks in particular benefit so hard from this, with many of them going from being pretty bland and uninspired to being incredibly unique and just amazing to look at. Like, have you seen Electron Avenue? Holy shit! Nitro Fueled has very few flaws, but unfortunately the ones that do exist are quite significant. For one, the load times are atrocious and only got worse with each subsequent update. If you're playing this on anything that's not a next-gen console, be prepared for load times that put the original release of Wrath of Cortex to shame. And even on those next-gen consoles, the loads still are not that great. And the online is... oh man, it's something. I do think people overinflated just how terrible it was during the game's heyday, but nowadays the lack of support and dedicated servers is horribly apparent. Even still, I guess bad online is better than no online? It really says a lot though that Nitro Fueled can have flaws this significant and still land in the top 3 on my list. Its strengths are really just that good that it manages to hold up amazingly, even in spite of the few terrible issues it has. I've already said multiple times now that I've come to value high highs and low lows over being consistently decent, but what if a game's quality isn't just consistently decent, but consistently amazing? Well, you get Crash Bandicoot 2. I don't think this game's peaks reach quite the same highs as Crash 1, Crash 3, or even Crash 4, but its base level of quality across the whole game is just unparalleled on every front. I don't think there's a single unmemorable level in this game. Everything is so amazingly crafted, so intricately thought out, From the level design to the clever secrets that encourage you to think outside the box to the presentation. This game took environments that, as evident by its remake, had every right to just be boring and uninspired, and it made them beautiful. The game's art style has absolutely stood the test of time, and I'd say that to this day, it's still one of the best in the series. And can we talk about this soundtrack? It clears every other game in the series. I'm sorry to people who love Wrath of Cortex's soundtrack, or Crash 3's soundtrack, or any other game that I might not have talked about yet, but Crash 2 just wins on this front. Every song is just perfect for the levels they play in, and they're all so memorable that 25.5 years later, I still am in love with it all. I struggle to think of a genuine criticism I have for Crash 2. I think the backtracking is overly criticized because, come on, it's not that bad. And the boss fights are... well, okay, I don't have an excuse for those. They suck outside of Tiny and Engine. But there's such a minute part of the game that they don't even come close to bringing it down in any way. Crash 2 is just damn near flawless. I don't like to say games are objectively good or bad, but if you were to ask me what Crash game I thought was objectively the best one, this would be my pick. But this isn't a list of the best, this is a list of my favorites.
Before you rises a cathedral of diabolical genius.
I would never, in my right mind, say that Crash Twinsanity is the best Crash game. But I do think that for every glaring flaw this game has, it does just as many if not more things right, and that's why it is my favorite Crash game. Before I get into any of that though, I want to clarify some things that are not why it's my favorite. More than a few times in the past, I've seen defenders of Twinsanity praise it for what it could have been. Basically, their thought process is, if this game had lived up to its potential, it would have been the best Crash game, and that's why I love it. And to be honest, I think that's kind of stupid. To me, it doesn't really matter what Twinsanity could have been, because that's not what Twinsanity is. The game should be judged on the merits of the product that got shipped out, not the endless concepts that ultimately never made it into the final game. So what about Twinsanity makes me love it so much? Honestly, everything. It's really hard to describe because Twinsanity is the kind of game where the sum is so much more than the whole of its parts. Every aspect of the game individually doesn't seem like much, but when it's wrapped up into one package, every piece plays off of each other in such a perfect harmony that it creates an absolute beauty of a game. The primary standout that most people default to is the game's dialogue and humor, and I can't even blame them. I think this is by far the funniest Crash game, and it's not even close. Every single line in this game is quotable and memorable, and even almost 2 decades after release, it still makes me laugh every time I play it, which is a lot. I see a lot of people tout this as an open world Crash game when it actually isn't. Sure, the game seamlessly transitions from one level to the next to create a giant, coherent world, but outside of the 4 hubs, you're still very much on a linear path, going from point A to point B to progress the story. It's much more akin to Crash 1 or Crash 4, minus the map, than it is to something like Spyro the Dragon or Jak and Daxter. That's not to say this is a bad thing though, because the level design is top notch. Even if they're still linear, the game very much takes advantage of the 3D space it has. On top of having side areas to explore, there's also a massive degree of verticality in the levels that no other game outside of 1 and 4 really achieves. I don't think there's a single truly bad level in this game, and plenty of them are genuinely fantastic. Ant Agony in particular is my favorite level across the entire series. The environments are also perfectly crafted. You have the very familiar Insanity Island as your first hub before gradually progressing to new areas that succeed in expanding the world of Crash Bandicoot but still feeling like a natural part of it. That, I think, is a huge part of what makes Twinsanity so great. I touched on this a bit in my boss ranking video, but I think the game is very good at paying homage to the games before it while also still bringing fresh ideas to the table. It doesn't feel like a rehash of things already done like Wrath of Cortex and Huge Adventure, but also doesn't feel so far removed from what came before it that it's out of place, like Titans or Mind Over Mutant. It feels like a natural evolution for the series. All of this is complemented by the most unique soundtrack I've ever heard in any video game. Composed entirely of acapella, this is the other highlight that most gravitate to. And while I think I still slightly give the edge to Crash 2 in terms of which soundtrack is my favorite, I have to say this is an extremely close second, perfectly fitting the wacky tone the game has. And I know it's going to be brought up, so I'll go ahead and address it myself. Yes, the game is extremely broken. Glitches are abundant.
And the thing is, I really don't care.
Similarly to gimmicks and derivativeness, I don't think glitches are inherently a bad thing. In fact, as long as they don't hinder the casual experience, I think they often add to the appeal of a game. And when it comes to Twinsanity, if you try to tell me that the glitches you found in your casual playthrough made the game unplayable, then I'm sorry, but I think you're lying. You have to be deliberately going out of your way to break this game in any meaningful way. There's no way in hell that any casual player would ever stumble upon all the crazy stuff you see in a Twinsanity speedrun, for example. Sure, you'll undoubtedly get the odd funny quirk here or there, but it's really no worse than any strange bug you would find in any of the PS1 Crash games, and trust me, I have plenty of experience with that. This game's detractors seem oddly fixated with how broken and glitchy it is, when if you ask me, that only adds to Twinsanity's appeal. The potential things you can do with it feel near limitless, and to me, that gives the game so much more life than if it wasn't broken. There's so much more that I could talk about, but we'd be here all day. Every individual piece of Twinsanity doesn't seem like much on its own, but when you put it all together, you get one of the funniest and most enjoyable Crash experiences out there. And I get asked this a lot, but no, I don't want a remake of this game with all the cut content. Not only do I think that such a game wouldn't even be close to coherent, I also think you run the risk of losing a lot of what makes this game so charming. I'd rather Toys for Bob, or whatever developers come along, keep their focus on new Crash material instead of trying to recapture lightning in a bottle. Because that's what Crash Twinsanity is. It's lightning in a bottle. We will never get a game quite like it ever again. It might have a lot of flaws, but what it does right is so amazing that it more than makes up for it. And that is why it is my favorite Crash Bandicoot game. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope I didn't anger you too much with my spicy takes. If you liked the video, be sure to leave a like and a comment below. If you want to see more videos like this, be sure to subscribe to the channel. I still have a lot of Crash topics I want to talk about, and maybe even eventually some more stuff beyond that, so I'm really grateful that this direction I'm taking my channel has been received so warmly. If you want to support me directly, please consider joining my Patreon. You get a lot of cool perks and updates regarding any video that I'm working on, and any amount you pledge goes directly towards helping me create content like this full time. I'll leave a link in the description below. I also stream almost every day over on Twitch, so if you want to watch me speedrun Crash Bandicoot games or anything else I'm doing, please consider checking that out as well. I'll leave a link to that in the description too. Otherwise, thank you so much again for watching. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I will see you all in the next video. First off, I'm not including any of the mobile phone games on this list. I believe that the Divine Philosophy, yeah, that's a thing.